I, 16, female, have been living with my dad, 42, male, and stepmom, 36, female, for the past 2 years. My bio mom, 39, female, divorced my dad 10 years ago, and they have joint custody of me. I used to see my mom on the weekends and sometimes visit her on the weekdays as well, till I turned 11, and then she moved to California to live with her boyfriend. I was obviously upset that I won't get as much time with her, but she promised me that she'd visit, which she never did. It's been 5 years since she left, and she hasn't visited once. I flew to see her one time around 4 years ago when she was getting married and wanted me to be a bridesmaid. But that was ages ago, and even then, I didn't get to be with her since she was too busy with the wedding and I had to fly back home the day after her wedding because I couldn't miss that many days off school. My father had been kind enough to even offer to pay for her trip since she and her husband weren't as financially well off, but she'd refused because she didn't want to take money from her ex. Every time I'd ask her to visit, she'd either say that she didn't have the money or she wasn't feeling well enough. But strangely, she always had the money and strength to go on vacations with her husband to far-off places with their friends. My father never said it to me because he didn't want to be the kind of person who talks crap about the mother of their child. But the truth was that my mother was more interested in being a socialite than a mom. Which wouldn't have been a problem, but she'd already become a mother and now she didn't feel up to the job, which was just really upsetting for me. It took me a while to come to terms with the fact that my mother just didn't care anymore, and I was on my own now, but eventually I accepted it and stopped calling or texting her. I just stopped bothering her altogether and would only speak to her when she'd call me and try to keep the conversation to a minimum because it was clear that to her, interacting with her own daughter was an obligation and not something that she actually wanted to do. So that was that. Anyway, coming to my stepmom, I'll call her Liza. She's been wonderful. My dad started dating her around 5 years ago, and while I wasn't too keen on her earlier, since I still believed that my parents could make it work, I warmed up to her gradually. She's always been there to comfort me whenever I'd miss my mom too much and has never had a mean word to say about her, despite everything. She got married to my dad 2 years ago and moved in with us. When I was going through the whole disillusionment phase about my mom and how she didn't care about me in the slightest, I would often be in a terrible mood for most of the day and would lash out over the pettiest things. This led to some arguments between me and my dad over my behavior, which I don't really blame him for, but even then, despite the way I'd been acting out, Liza had always been there by my side and would even fight with my dad on my behalf. I don't say this lightly, but honestly, she's been the mother that I've never had. So a few weeks ago, my dad and Liza brought up how they wanted Liza to adopt me legally. Since my mother hadn't visited to see me in so long, they thought that this was the best decision in view of the situation, and I agreed with them wholeheartedly. Liza and I were more than happy to agree to this arrangement since I already considered her to be a second mother to me, and more of a willing mother, not someone who'd just been pushed into the role and couldn't even be bothered to come and see her daughter. There was just the tiniest issue of making my bio mom sign away her parental rights, which I knew wouldn't be easy. She didn't care about me, but she sure did care about how people perceived her, which I'd learned at her wedding itself. She'd made a huge deal of me attending her wedding and was constantly bragging to her friends and her husband's relatives about how she'd flown me in against her ex's wishes and fought for me to be present at her wedding. She wanted to portray herself as some great mom who'd gone against all the odds for me to come to her wedding. But the truth was, my dad's only concern was that I'd be missing school right before finals week, and he didn't want my grades to be affected. In fact, their relationship had absolutely nothing to do with his unwillingness to send me to the wedding. He'd even accompanied me and paid for our tickets and at a nearby hotel since my mother's husband wasn't comfortable with me living with them. I didn't say anything back then because I was just happy to be in her company, but now I realize how messed up that was, pretending to be the victim of a situation just so that people will praise you for being a good mother. Even now, she posts my achievements and stuff on her social media accounts and brags about me all the time. But that's just for show. On a personal level, she really couldn't care less about me and only calls me out of guilt. I know I shouldn't say this about my own mother, but I really don't think she's fit to be one, very honestly. My dad asked my mother to sign away her parental rights 2 weeks ago, and her reaction was nothing short of livid. My dad had video called her to discuss this with him, and we'd all been present there as well. My dad had been the one doing all the talking, and as soon as he got to asking her to give up her parental rights, she began screaming at him and said a lot of cruel things about not just him, but also Liza. And within a minute or two, she'd made Liza burst into tears because the things she said were so unthinkably horrible. She'd called her a monster who wants to steal her life away from her, and she even taunted her, saying that maybe she was infertile, which is why she couldn't even have babies of her own. So she resorted to stealing other people's children. Liza had a miscarriage a couple of years before she met my dad, and I'd only found out about it accidentally, so I knew that pregnancy was a sensitive topic for her. Even if it hadn't been, whatever my mom said was extremely harsh and unacceptable. So my dad got into a huge fight that day. I told her off as well because she simply couldn't speak to someone that I loved in this horrible way. And I think she didn't like the fact that I'd stood up for Liza against her. So she began to try and manipulate me by reminding me of how she was my real mom, no matter what everyone else says. I felt like a little emotionally overwhelmed at that point, so I decided to not speak to her about this anymore. At least not then, since it was clearly not the right time to have this discussion. So a few days later, I decided to speak to her one-on-one without my parents knowing and called her up. She tried to pretend the earlier conversation hadn't happened at all and acted as if everything was normal. But after a few minutes of small talk, I did bring up the parental rights thing once more. I told her that while it was sweet that she didn't want to give her rights up, I also wanted her to know that over the years, she'd become more and more disconnected from me, and it was very obvious that our relationship was nothing more than a formality at this point. She tried to argue, saying that just because she doesn't visit often doesn't mean that she doesn't care, and brought up all the social media posts dedicated to me. I told her that none of that actually counts because ever since she left, she's never once visited, and neither has she bothered to ever ask me about my well-being, and only sticks to weekly small talk. Her social media posts are only for show and don't hold any meaning at all. When I told her this, she got offended and told me that I was being an ungrateful brat and that she could see the effect of being left with my dad now since they'd managed to turn me against her. I was quite frustrated at that point since my dad or Liza had never said anything bad about her, and it was her own actions that had forced me to come to this conclusion, that I'd be better off without her. So we ended up getting into a fight once again, and at the end of it, she just told me straight up that I could fight her all I wanted to, but she wasn't giving up her rights as a parent, since she had a reputation to think of as well, and she wasn't going to throw all of it away just so that Liza could have me. So I needed to just suck it up and accept that she was my mom, no matter how much Dad or Liza wanted me to hate her. After that, she hung up, and I was left flabbergasted because I truly thought that my mother would, for once, put my happiness over her own and try to be less of a show-off. But obviously that's not going to happen, at least not in this life. So in a fit of anger, I decided to take a social media myself as well and do something that would ruin her so-called reputation as a good mom. I wrote a huge rant about everything that had happened in these past few years and how everything that my mother did was nothing but a pretense that she put up for the world to see and praise. I just let out years of pent-up resentment in that one post and didn't even give myself a chance to rethink my decision before I hit the post. I tagged my mother in the post as well so that it would appear on her profile as well, and the people she'd been so desperate to impress would be able to see the reality as well. After that, I turned my phone off and decided to clear my head, so I played some video games. Within an hour, though, my dad was in my room and he looked really serious. I could tell that when my mother hadn't been able to reach me, she'd called him up to inform him about what I'd done. I was nervous because he looked grim, but also he didn't look angry, so I had no idea what to expect. He sat me down and asked me if I'd posted about my mother on Facebook and tagged her, and I said yes, and then he asked me if this was to make sure she gave up her parental rights. And I agreed to that as well because there was no point in lying about something like this. He seemed satisfied and just left without saying anything else. I'd thought that he'd scold me at the very least for going public about our personal lives, but he did nothing of the sort. So I decided to go back online and check what my mother was up to. She'd sent me at least 50 texts a couple of minutes after I'd posted, and all of them were demands to take that post down. She'd accused me of trying to ruin her reputation on purpose and blame my dad and Liza for all of it, even though they had nothing to do with it. She must have been pretty desperate to get the post taken down, though, since she'd been requesting me and had been trying to go all sentimental on me through her text, saying that this wasn't how she raised me. She'd removed my post from her feed, but it was no use since some of her friends had already seen it, and the gossip would obviously spread like wildfire. I texted her back saying that she needed to give up her parental rights because at this point, neither did she love me like a mother is supposed to, and neither did I love her like a daughter. So it was pointless pretending that we still share the same relationship that we once did. It's been a few days since then, and I haven't heard back from her personally, but she's been speaking to my dad. What I did was an attempt to drive her away so that Liza could be my mother legally, and everyone involved knew that. I don't know exactly what they've been discussing, but I'm sure that my mother is still not willing to give up her rights, since I can hear my dad arguing with her every other day, but can never make out what they're saying. I still want Liza to be my mother, but seeing my bio mom fight back and show some concern regarding me, just this once, is now just confusing me. And I have mixed feelings about what I did. So aita for accusing my mom of faking her relationship with me on social media so she'd give up her parental rights and I could be adopted by my stepmother? Update 1. It's been 3 days since the last update, and this morning my dad informed me that my mother would be visiting. She's coming to see me in a day or two, and I'm already so nervous about what's going to happen. This is going to be the first time that I speak to my mother after that post, and I feel awful. I know a lot of people thought that what I had done was totally justified, but then, I don't know, I can't bring myself to feel good about the post. I haven't deleted it because I know it's all true, but my relationship with my mom is so damn complicated that I don't even know how to feel about any of this. My dad sounds pretty resigned about this whole situation, so the only person who's keeping me sane right now is Liza. Update 2. I met my mom today. She'd come over in the afternoon, and it was tense to say the least. Things were uncomfortable with me, my dad, my mother, and Liza all under one roof, and I knew it was going to get worse from there because obviously the discussion that was going to be had was not exactly one that would be all sunshine and rainbows. She ignored me the entire time that she was there and kept her conversation limited to my dad only, though even when I wanted to say something. She pretended she couldn't hear me and would continue to speak to my father. Despite her behavior, it was really strange that she was still unwilling to terminate her rights as a parent. After that post, she'd pretty much cut me off since we hadn't spoken at all, and even today she refused to even acknowledge my existence. So it's baffling to me why she would even fight to remain my parent legally when she has the perfect opportunity to get rid of me. It sounds crude, but that's exactly what she wants from the looks of it. She didn't even hug me or say anything when she saw me for the first time in so many years. So you can only imagine how uninterested she is in being a mother. It can't be about her reputation or image or whatever among her friends as well, because after my post, there must have been some speculations at the very least. I'm just really confused as to why she's still refusing to give me up right now. My father also brought these things up during the argument that they were having, and she told him that she had her reasons. We hadn't gotten the law involved yet, since we wanted to try and work this arrangement out on our own first and try to resolve whatever issue my mom would have civilly, but this was proving to be more and more difficult. They're pretty much in a deadlock right now, even after my mom flew all the way back here. I don't know what the purpose of coming back was, even if there's going to be no progress regarding this either. She doesn't come to visit me, and when she finally does, it's not even a happy reunion. I have absolutely no idea what she wants at this point. Even Liza, who's literally the most positive person I know and has always avoided saying anything mean about my mother, was really upset today. She and I had even been considering letting go of this whole idea earlier when we saw how hard my mother was fighting to retain her rights, because we genuinely thought that she was going to change and be a better mother. But after today's visit, it doesn't seem like she's going to change. This is all just messing with my head right now. Update 3. Yesterday my mother visited, and today I found out some big news. Last night, my mother's husband reached out to me through Facebook. We'd only ever interacted once through all these years back at my mother's wedding, and he'd been really sweet to me. I'd been very confused back then because, like I'd mentioned earlier, my mother had claimed that he wasn't even comfortable with me living with them. But he'd been perfectly nice to me when I met him. And yesterday, it all finally made sense. So he texted me asking if I needed any help. I was really confused, so I asked him what he meant by that, and then he ended up spilling the beans on what my mother had been telling him all these years. Apparently, she'd made my dad and Liza sound like awful people who had forbidden me from seeing her or meeting her, and had even brainwashed me into believing that she was the bad guy there. She'd been taking loads and loads of money from him through the years and fooling him into believing that she'd send the money to my dad to pay for my education and stuff. Not just that, but he'd also been told by my mother that the reason she didn't visit me either was because my dad would cause a lot of unnecessary drama, so she found it best to just stay away and try to contribute financially. Obviously, none of that is true, and my mother hasn't given my dad a single dollar ever since the divorce for my sake or otherwise. My mom's husband had felt terrible about all of this, which is why he'd been readily handing over whatever money my mother asked of him, and since she was so sensitive, he never asked about what became of the money either. Back when he saw my post, it did raise some red flags, but my mother had instructed him to never speak to me to avoid any confrontation with my dad, so he didn't contact me. My mother had explained to him that the post was just a tactic by my stepmother to show her in a bad light, that's all. So she'd convinced her husband that she needed to visit me and rescue me from here because she'd had enough of this crap now, and that's why she'd even bothered to come by, just to go the extra mile to fool her husband. I couldn't believe what her husband told me, and it took me several minutes to even make sense of it all. My mother had just been lying to all of us for so long, just for the sake of money. She didn't care about me in the least. I couldn't even imagine how she could stoop so low, but yeah, a few minutes after I heard from him what had been going on, I told him the truth and didn't spare any detail. He left my message on read, probably out of shock and disbelief, and hasn't replied yet. I also woke up my dad and Liza last night to tell them about the conversation that I just had, and even they were shocked to their very core. We've been trying to get in touch with my mom, but haven't been able to reach her yet, even though it's almost noon right now. My dad is furious, and I'm guessing so is her husband. I don't know what's going to happen now, but one thing's for sure. Now my mom will simply just have to do what I ask of her unless she wants every single person to know what a scammer she is. Update 4. Today was the day that Liza finally adopted me as her daughter, and I couldn't be more thrilled about it. As for my mother, she had no option but to sign her parental rights away. The day we found out that she'd been lying to her husband and us as well, just to get some money out of him, we confronted her and there was a huge fight. She was hysterical and accused me and my father of ruining her marital life and called me a curse that she wished she'd gotten rid of. My dad told her that if she didn't give up her rights by herself voluntarily, that he'd be forced to drag her to court, and that would be bad for her, given what we know about her. She had to leave a day after that anyway, since her husband had also decided to file for divorce after he'd learned the truth. She was definitely in a lot of trouble already and didn't want more. So she did end up agreeing to terminate her parental rights, which is why Liza was finally able to adopt me today. My mother took to social media to complain about how me and my father had made her life nothing short of a nightmare, and since we couldn't tolerate seeing her happy, we just had to swoop in and destroy her life. I don't know how exactly any of this was my fault or my father's fault, but we didn't bother responding to any of her posts, so we merely blocked her everywhere and are trying to move on with our lives now. I felt awful earlier when I'd found out about my mother and her huge scam because it just went on to show that she cared about money more than me. But it's okay now. I'm over it all. I finally have a family that really, truly cares for me and a mother who wants to be my mother. I'm glad that my mother is no longer in my life because even though I did spend some good years with her, she didn't love me as much as Liza does. I'm grateful for all that has happened and hopefully there won't be any more drama in store for me this year. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.